In this episode, we're going to jump into how to get yourself on other people's podcasts and leverage this channel to grow your brand. All right. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Confessions of a B2B Marketer, and more specifically, the content SEO, social flywheel, or in other words, the content machine journey that we're going on. And so just to quickly recap, in episode 1, I explained what the thing is, what the journey is. And then in episode 2, I outlined what the plan was, the tools, who's in the team, and what we're actually planning to execute. And so in this episode 3, we're going to jump into the first deep dive into one of the workflows within the content SEO social flywheel. And this specific workflow is in the guest content section. Remember, we had owned content and guest content. So owned content is things like posting things to your own social channels and uploading content onto your own blog. In the guest content, there's actually just 2. The first of which is being a guest on someone's podcast, and the second of which is writing written content to be put on someone else's blog. So let's jump right into the strategy. And the first thing I want to talk about is who does what. Well, actually, probably before that, we should talk about what we're actually going to be doing. So essentially, we're just going to run an outreach campaign to relevant shows within our niche. And then we're going to experience some kind of conversion rate from that outreach to getting booked. Then you or someone within your team, typically the thought leader within the B2B company, is going to go onto that show to be interviewed as a guest. The host of that show or their business will do all the editing, create all the assets, and then we'll also be helping them promote the show afterwards. So that's what we're going to be doing, but who does what? Remember, I mentioned in the team section that we had a full-time admin/outreach person. So this person is going to be responsible for finding the shows that we should be on with our instruction. And when I say I mean you, the person listening, which is typically going to be someone within the marketing team of the B2B company or the founder or CEO. And so we're going to create the instructions for this person to find the shows. We're then going to review the shows just to check that they are in line with what we think would be good for us to go on. Then that person is going to run the outreach process. And then when people start to reply and accept them, we can kind of take on that communication. And then we or someone else, the thought leader, is going to jump on the show, be the guest. And then we are also going to help promote that episode. So question 1 is, how are we going to find the right shows to go on? Now, a really, really simple way to do this is to simply go to a website called owltail.com, and I'll link that below in the show notes, and then simply search for the names of one of your competitors. And ideally, if the competitor is relatively well known, they're going to show up, and Owltail is going to list all of the podcasts that they've been a guest on. This is a really fast, awesome strategy, and it actually helps with one other thing that we'll talk about a bit later. But that's the first way. The second way is to go to the chartable category rankings for your country. So for this show, Confessions of a B2B Marketer, the category that we are within and want to rank in is marketing in the UK. And so we can go to the UK marketing rankings and see the top 250 podcasts in our category and then add those into the list. So once we have that list, and we can start by building a list of 50, you can just put this into a Google Sheet. And well, instead of you doing it, I would give it to the admin outreach person to do, but you'd give them the instructions I just gave you there. Add 50 into the sheet. You can go and review and just check that, for example, they've released episodes in the past 6 months, or check they're not competing with you, for example. So let's say that pushes us down to 45. We're then going to start with the outreach. So we typically recommend reaching out both through social channels and through email almost at the same time. And so we're going to create a Google Doc, and in that Google Doc, we're going to add the outreach messages. And I'll put example outreach messages in the show notes below. But essentially what we're going to be saying is, we heard this other person on the show. And remember, Owltail can help us with that because we've already found episodes of their show where our competitor's been on. So we say, I heard Jason's episode on your podcast and really enjoyed it. Are you open to having another guest? To make sure it's one of your most downloaded episodes, we will do. And we're going to list 3 to 4 things of how we're going to help them promote the show. If you're interested, we're then going to cover, or we could possibly cover these different topics. And then we're going to list 3 to 4 topics that you can cover that are going to be relevant to their audience. Let me know if it makes sense to chat. That's like the email version. The social or like the LinkedIn outreach version is going to be a much more shortened. Essentially, hey, I heard X's episode on your podcast. Are you open to another guest? If yes, I have an interesting proposal. Please share your email address. And then ideally we get the email and we send that email that I just explained to you. So what's happening here? First, we have to understand what a podcast host wants. It's typically two things. A, they want to grow their show. And so right at the start of that message, we're saying, this is how we're going to help make this one of your most downloaded episodes. So we're speaking directly to their biggest need, really, which is to grow their show. And the second thing they're concerned of is, like, am I going to be able to create good content for my audience? Is my audience going to enjoy this? And so that's why we're listing different topics that are going to be relevant to their audience in that email as well. So we've seen pretty solid, like, responses to this kind of outreach. Now, it's obviously the conversion rate of your outreach is obviously dependent on how, like, ambitious you're going. Let's say you try to book on Tim Ferriss's show. It's, like, basically impossible unless Tim comes to you. He very rarely would take inbound. But if you're hitting up, like, the number 245th ranked marketing podcast, then you're going to have a much greater conversion rate on that outreach. So once we have that process up and running, we have the message template in a Google Doc. We're tracking all of the outreach in a Google Sheet. We just need to ensure that we're doing a consistent number of outreach per week. Now, we typically have this at around 10 to 20 outreaches every week. And if we do this, you should ideally be booking, after a couple of weeks, you should be booking 1 to 2 shows per week, and you should really be recording approximately one show every week. The other thing I'll add here is that, especially when you're starting out, it doesn't matter if the shows that you're going on do not have that much popularity. And there are a couple of ways to do this, but to really get to the bottom of that, you have to look at the number of ratings and reviews. You can go into a tool like Podstatus to understand how many, if they're ranking in any of the categories. You can look at the social followings of the host and the host business. And then you can also look at the organic traffic or referring domains to their website and their podcast website. But it doesn't matter at the start, especially if you're jumping on shows that are not that popular, because you need to practice. The more you practice, the better you'll get. And so when you do go onto that bigger show, you're going to have a much bigger impact, because the way you talk and the way you're able to share your ideas is going to be much more polished after you've done 10 shows that are a little bit more, like, not as great following, but you've been honing your skills. So that is the outreach process. That is how we're going to get booked onto shows. Again, the templates are going to be below. I'll probably also put a template Google Sheet so you can just use that as the tracker. How are we going to judge the success? So we're going to be looking, obviously, at the funnel for our outreach. So how many have we outreached to? How many people have replied? How many have booked? How many have recorded? And how many have released? So that's the outreach funnel. There's 5 steps. I say that sometimes there's a difference between recorded and released, because you may go on a show and they may not like you and they might not release it. It's completely up to them if they want to release it or not. It rarely happens, to be honest, but it could happen. So those are the 5 steps. And we're probably looking, if we outreach to 100, we're probably looking for like 10 replies. We probably should get 3 to 4 booked, 3 to 4 recorded, and ideally 3 to 4 released. After that, we're going to be looking for qualitative feedback from the market to understand whether this campaign is having an impact. So to do this, if somebody pings you on LinkedIn saying, heard your episode on X, would love to connect, that is good qualitative feedback. If you have a proposal or a demo form on your site and you have a free text field asking people where they found you, ideally we're looking for podcast or on X podcast in those fields. In terms of other metrics, we'd see some organic traffic increases on branded terms and maybe even increase in direct traffic, but it's very hard to tie that to anything. So a big part of the content machine is not going to be directly attributable via metrics or ebook downloads or website visits. But what we're looking for is that more of the revenue you're generating is going to be influenced by these activities, which is why possibly the best way is to ask with a free text field on your sign up form, etc., where people found us. And that is how we can do the attribution. And just some final tips here. When you're actually on the podcast that you're being the guest on, I typically would try to avoid pitching in any way or really mentioning your product in any way unless it's embedded into a story that you're telling. The host is not going to want you to pitch. None of the listeners want you to pitch, but it's still obviously good for you to mention your product, but just not in a way that's obvious. So let's say I just came on a show and the host asked me like how I got into podcasting. I would simply tell the story of how in 2017, I started a podcast with a business. It went really well. But then I also was head of marketing at a B2B SaaS company in like 2019. We started a show and then it went really well. So I left. They became a client of mine. And then we just took that process, pasted it to 30 other clients. And that is how I got into podcasting. And so in that story, I'm bringing up the topic of the service that I sell, which is Fame, the podcast agency. Also super important, if you have your own show, it's very important to mention that at the end of the episode when they ask you, typically at the end, they'll say, where can the audience find you on the internet? You would say your social profiles, your website, your email address, and make sure you say your podcast, because if these people are listening to a podcast in your niche, that means they're primed. These people like podcasts. And so it's a really good way to grow your show. Typically, a host will link to you. Typically, every podcast will release a blog post on their domain that will have show notes that will link to the guests. So here, this is a really good backlink opportunity. And so ideally, we're trying to get a backlink to every one of your domains that you have. So if you have multiple businesses, ask for a backlink to both. I would ideally put your focus social channels, so LinkedIn, Twitter, your podcast, and your website domain. If you can get all those links, great. And you probably will be able to. You just have to mention that to the host, either by email before or after. Just send them all links and be like, it would be awesome if we could add these all into the show notes. And that is just going to be great for your general SEO presence. Now we come to the promotion, and most guests won't actually do any promotion. Well, most guests will probably share half-heartedly on social, but they won't do anything else. And so what we're going to do to set us apart here is actually promote. Remember, we are trying to build relationships with these people anyway. They have an audience of the people that could be your customers, and therefore it's great to build relationships. A really good way to build relationships is to add as much value as you possibly can. At the start of the relationship, so this person knows that you're one of the good guys. And so a couple of ways that we're going to promote, and you'll see this in the template, is if you have any blog posts on your site that talk about podcasts within a niche, it's a pretty good strategy anyway. So you just put the top podcasts in your niche on your blog. Those pages typically rank quite well. So what we're going to do is we can offer to put their podcast in that list if it's not there already. That's one thing. Obviously, we're going to share organically on your social profiles. The way we do that is we're going to pull out the biggest insights, the most controversial, valuable, interesting insights, give the whole insight in the post, and just as an afterthought, link to the full episode from the comments below. Those posts actually are going to get the most engagement, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about social posting organically in a future episode. We're also going to offer to run paid spend, typically on Facebook, and we'll give a small amount, say $50. This will be in the outreach email. So if you're going to offer to link, offer to share, offer to paid promote, this is going to drastically improve the conversion rate of the outreach, but it's also going to build that relationship because you'll actually probably end up having a very well downloaded episode. They're going to like you. They're going to refer you people. They're going to bring you on again in the future if you would like. The final point is any feedback you get about the episode, people coming to you on DMs or you potentially even landing a customer from that, always send that back to the host. That makes them feel good about the value they're adding to their guest and about their whole show. So there we go. That is the overview of how to run this first workflow of the SEO, content, social, flywheel, and its podcast guesting. To summarize, we're going to run essentially an outreach campaign. We're going to aim to do 10 to 20 outreaches per week and ideally aim to record one episode per week and therefore over a bit of time, release one episode per week. We're going to set ourselves apart from everybody else, reaching out to them to be on the show by saying we'll actually promote and by offering topics that we know their audience are going to engage in. Also in the outreach, we're making it clear that we've actually listened to their show because we're calling out a specific episode that we enjoyed. And then we're going to aim to get as many backlinks as we possibly can from the blog post that they release. We're not going to talk about our product during the episode. And then we're actually going to promote, as this is going to build the relationship with this potential partner, which will always lead to great things over time. So I hope that was valuable. In future episodes, we're going to be digging into other workflows within the content machine. If you did enjoy the episode, it would be great if you could leave your review in the form of an Apple Podcast rating and review. Simply search for Confessions of a B2B Marketer in Apple Podcast, or actually in Spotify now. Leave an honest rating and review. I will start calling out reviews in future episodes. So if you leave your name in there, I'll definitely give you a shout out. Actually, ping me on LinkedIn or drop me an email at tom@fame.so and I'll make sure I can get that read out. And I'll also give a shout out to your business at the same time. Free advertising. Thank you so much for listening.